What is morality? At its most basic, morality is about right or wrong action. It's a question of what we should do or what we shouldn't do. Or maybe another way of putting that is to ask the question of what we're obligated to do, morally speaking, or not obligated to do. So as Plato says, what we're really asking is the question of how we ought to live, how we ought to guide our actions, or by what principles or rules we ought to use to guide our actions. Now in this chapter, I want to discuss sort of the nature of morality in general. As we go on in the course, we'll be talking about different moral theories, particular moral theories or particular approaches to ethics. And these approaches will attempt to tell us how we ought to guide our actions, how we ought to live, what our obligations are, or what we're not obligated to do. But for our purposes here, I want to give a general overview of morality in general. So we'll talk about things like the difference between moral motivation and moral justification. I'll talk about the three major divisions in ethics. Turns out morality or ethics, and I will use those terms interchangeably, that morality or ethics can be broken down into three sort of sub-disciplines. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'd like to look at what a moral argument is. We talk about moral arguments. We talk about making moral arguments. But I don't think we're always clear on exactly what that means. How does a moral argument differ from any other sort of argument? And so at one point also, when we're looking at moral arguments, I'll give you a sort of brief introduction on how to evaluate moral arguments. So the first aspect of morality I want to discuss is the notion of moral motivation versus moral justification. Now, many times we don't make a distinction between these two. Moral motivation is an explanation as to why we behave morally. So to give you an example, if someone comes up to you and asks you for money on the street, they say, "Please, I'm hungry, can you give me some money?" Now, forgetting all the sort of details or the complications of whether the money will actually be used for food or whether it'll be used for something else, let's just assume that the person asking for food actually needs the money for food. Now, the question is, if I see you reach into your pocket and give that individual $1, I might ask you two sorts of questions. One question might be, why did you give it, in the sense of what moral theory was guiding your action? Or I might say, what motivated you to give that money? So if we're talking about moral motivation, we're asking a question of what sort of psychologically compels you to act in a certain way. So for some, the answer might be something like this. I felt sorry for that individual. I looked at the person coming up to me. They looked desperate. They looked needy. It made me feel bad, and that sympathy for that individual, maybe even empathy for that individual, made me reach into my pocket and give them money. So that might be one way you're motivated morally. One might say that your moral motivation is based on sympathy. Another possible motivation might be religious conviction. So when that person comes up and says, "Could you please spare $1? I need some food," and you reach in your pocket, you hand them $1, and I say, "Why did you do that?" And you say, "Well, I did that because my religion tells me I ought to help those in need. So if someone asks you for something and you can spare it, you ought to give. And so I want to please my God. I want to follow the dictates of my church." Something along those lines, it might be that that's your moral motivation. Now, for the most part, in this course, we won't be concerned about moral motivation. Why you act morally, why you're a moral person versus an immoral person, or why you strive to be a moral person versus not caring about being a moral person, that will be left completely up to you. I will assume, for the purposes of this course, and as we read the various authors who are attempting to give us an argument for their position or their view on a particular subject, what I will do is assume that you have the following motivational assumption. Now, even if you don't have this assumption, let's all play sort of the morality game. Let's pretend for a moment that we actually are motivated by the following, and that is the desire to justify our actions on grounds others could not reasonably reject. So for the purposes of this course, and as you read, especially later as we read some of the applied issues in business ethics, I want you to sort of get in the mental framework of thinking, could I justify my position to others on grounds they couldn't reasonably reject? So someone could reasonably reject an argument in which you said, well, that's just how I feel. Well, I think it would be reasonable for me to say that if you give me an argument that says this action is morally right, and you say, I'm basing this on what? Give me your justification. You say, oh, well, you see, I'm justifying this on this is how I feel, or that's just my opinion. I think a reasonable person could say, well, that's fine that you feel that way, but that's really not a justification. So when you're presenting an argument, whether it's to me or you're posting something on a discussion board, I'm going to assume that your motivational assumption is that you really do want to justify your actions on grounds others will accept, on grounds that they'll find compelling. Now, so to make a distinction between moral motivation, there's moral justification. And so justification consists of the reasons in favor of a particular moral theory or position. Now, there are any number of moral justifications, and actually a lot of this course will be about putting forth reasons for various positions. So as we're looking at moral theories, there will be reasons given why you should follow this moral theory versus another. So when we look at someone like John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, the utilitarians will say, here's why we think you are, or it's justified for you to follow our utility principle. On the other hand, the Kantians will come and say, no, here's a different moral position, and we have our reasons, and we think these are good reasons for being a Kantian. So for the purposes of our course, as you can see, in here it's going to be based mainly on moral justification. There is some overlap at times between motivation and justification. But by and large, what I'm concerned about is what you can argue for, what reasons you can give in favor of your particular position. And that's what we're going to focus on. So there's a distinction to be kept in mind here. What motivates you morally is important. It's important from a personal standpoint, but what I'm concerned with primarily is moral justification. Now, before we get into sort of moral arguments in general, let's talk a little bit about the major divisions in ethics. Now, the first area of ethics, which we won't discuss too much, the first three sort of chapters that we'll be covering in the textbook will deal with metaethics. And metaethics is the activity of investigating the concepts and methods of ethics, rather than directly engaging with practical issues of what to do and how to behave. So, while that sounds a little complicated, it's actually not. When we talk about metaethics, what we're really asking is what makes a moral statement true or false. So, for example, we'll talk about subjectivism. And what the subjectivist believes is something like this. A subjectivist will say what makes a moral statement true or false. So if I say murder is wrong, the metaethicist might say, okay, well, what makes that statement, murder is wrong, what makes that true or false? So I might say to you, murder is wrong, and you say true. And I say, why is it true? What makes it true? Now, what the subjectivist might say, and this is just one metaethical position, the metaethicist, the subjectivist, might say, well, all moral statements are really just reporting what you believe. So when I say murder is wrong, what I'm really saying, or that statement could be translated into, I, the speaker, believe murder is wrong. And we can do that with any moral statement. If I say something like stealing is wrong, the metaethicist, who's a subjectivist, might say, well, all you really mean by that is you, the speaker, believe murder is wrong. Now, there are a whole bunch of implications of that. If all moral statements simply boil down to what I believed, then we'd have some trouble because you might believe something different. And then we might ask, well, if I believe one thing and you believe another, that means certain moral statements could be true and false at the same time, which would be a contradiction. So metaethicists really want to know what makes those statements true or false. How should we approach ethics in general and the nature of ethical statements? Now, for the most part in our course, we will talk a little bit about metaethics. So at the very beginning, the relativism and the subjectivism, those theories or those approaches are metaethical approaches, and we'll talk a little bit about the problems with those positions. By and large, though, we're going to focus on these next two divisions in ethics. The second one is normative ethics. And normative ethics is the study of the concepts involved in practical reasoning, notions of good, right, duty, obligation, virtue, freedom, rationality, choice, and so forth. So what the normative ethicist wants to know is which principles should we follow or which principles are justified? What does it mean to say something's good or something's right? What are our duties or obligations? What does it mean to say someone is free? What does it mean to say someone's rational? So normative ethics are studying the concepts involved with practical reasoning. So we'll be doing a lot with normative ethics. This is the chapters on social contract theory, utilitarianism, Kantianism. These approaches will be normative approaches. And we'll also be doing some normative ethics as we talk about specific issues in business ethics. So the question of what is a person, for example. In business ethics, we might ask questions about things like, are corporations persons? And what do you mean by person? And if it is a person, what obligations do they have? Well, what obligations do persons have? And you can see how these concepts, these ideas of obligation and good and right are going to come into play if we start defining things as persons. Well, now we open up a whole bunch of other questions that need to be answered. So this is what the normative ethicist will do. They'll look at these ideas and say, what does it mean to say you're free? Or what does it mean to say you made a choice? Finally, there's practical ethics or applied ethics. And this is a subject that applies to ethics in actual practical problems. So it's one thing to say people ought to be free. And then I might say, well, in this particular case, did I violate this person's freedom? So practical ethics in a lot of ways is simply an application of normative ethics to very particular subjects or cases. So if I say, is it okay for me to deny a person a permit to protest outside City Hall? Well, you might say, doesn't that violate their freedom of expression? And I might say, okay, what does freedom mean? Is it free to protest whenever they want, wherever they want? Is all speech protected? Can hate speech be regulated? Can speech that endangers others be regulated? So really, practical ethics is say, let's look at all the nuances. Let's look at all the details of this particular case and ask ourselves how these concepts can be applied in this particular situation. And so with business ethics, I mean, almost by definition, business ethics is an applied ethic. It's applying normative ethics, concepts and principles of ethics to particular business situations or situations in business ethics. Now, as I mentioned before, we often talk in terms of moral argument. We often talk about argumentation. Just what is a moral argument? Well, at its most basic, a moral argument consists of a major premise, which is some general moral principle. You ought not to harm others would be a general moral principle. Secondly, there's a minor premise, which is some factual claim. My taking a baseball bat to my friend's head would harm that person. Conclusion, then, is a moral determination. So for an argument to be a moral argument, it must have a general moral principle as its major premise. Without that general moral principle, we just have a regular old logical argument. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion. You might have seen this in 4th grade or maybe in high school if they covered some logic. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion. That by itself doesn't give us a moral argument. What a moral argument requires is a general moral principle. So let's look at an example. And this one comes right from your textbook. It is wrong to use people as a means to other people's ends. General moral principle. Taking baby Teresa's organs would be using her as a means to other people's ends. Specifically, taking baby Teresa's organs would be used as a means of benefiting other infants that could use her organs. Therefore, moral determination, taking baby Teresa's organs, would be wrong. Now, if you're not familiar with this case, not going to go into the details, you go to chapter 1 in your textbook, and you'll see that this is a case in which there was an encephalitic child, that is a child with no higher brain, born without physically a higher brain, who by some chance actually survived birth, and doctors were questioning whether they could harvest her organs before she died naturally. And there's a good reason why the doctors wanted to do this. It turns out that when children like this survive birth, they live for a very short time. And it also turns out that what our normal notion of death, that suddenly someone just stops breathing, isn't exactly what happens on a physiological level. What normally happens is various organs begin to shut down. And as those organs shut down, toxins are released into the bloodstream and into other organs, damaging other organs, to the point where those organs can't be used. So the question was, could we take this unfortunate child's organs before she died a natural death. Now, how do we want to evaluate this argument? For some, and oftentimes when I'm asking or presenting this in class, I ask students, how many of you believe we ought to harvest her organs? And generally speaking, I get a large majority of people saying, yes, we ought to harvest the organs. Why? Well, because these organs can save a number of other children. Baby Teresa isn't going to live. She's not going to use those organs. We might as well get some use out of them. Other times, though, there are people who will say, well, no, we can't just take her organs. She can't be used like that. She's not a thing. So the question is, how do I want to evaluate this sort of argument? Is this a good argument? Is it a strong argument? Is it an argument we want to follow? Well, there are several different ways we can approach a moral argument. So, for example, how might we evaluate a moral argument? Well, one thing I can ask of a moral argument, is it valid? Now, a valid argument is an argument in which it's impossible for the premises to all be true and the conclusion false. So in the previous example, so with Baby Teresa's organs, it said, well, if the premise is, if it's wrong to use one person as a means to helping others, and if taking her organs, the factual claim is that taking Baby Teresa would be using her as a means to others' benefit, then it seems that there's no other conclusion that could follow. In other words, that is a valid argument. But we can also ask a second question. Is that a sound argument? A sound argument is a valid argument with premises that are in fact true. So the second thing, on the most sort of simple level, is we can look at the nature of the argument and ask, one, does the conclusion necessarily follow from the premises? The second thing we can ask is, are the premises true? And there's another thing that we can actually look at with moral arguments as well, and that is we can ask the question, are there any ambiguities in the terms? In other words, is there anything in the premises, in the moral principle or in the factual claim, that might need clarification, words or ideas? So let's look again at the argument. It is wrong to use people as a means to other people's ends. As I said before, if this is true, and if taking Baby Teresa's organs would be using her as a means to other people's ends, then it seems to follow, yes, taking organs would be wrong. But now I might look at premise one, and I might think to myself, it is wrong to use people as a means to other people's ends. Well, one question we might ask is, well, what does it mean for someone to be a person? It's clearly the case that if I come to you, a normal, healthy, functioning individual, and I were to take your organs from you, I were to kill you, take your organs, and distribute those to others, that would definitely be wrong. You are a person. But is Baby Teresa a person? So one way of looking at this is to say, well, the premise sounds good. It is wrong to use people as means to other people's ends. And in fact, if we're talking about a person, that is actually something we should be concerned about. But is Baby Teresa a person? What does it mean to be a person? And here's where we get into the sort of intricacies of ethics. Person might be defined in two ways. We could talk about biological persons, that is, things that are a lot like us, biologically speaking. They have our DNA, they look like us, and so forth. But we also might want to talk about personhood in a slightly different way, as a psychological or moral category. So when I think of persons, I think of individuals that can think, that can perceive the external world, that can feel or touch, hear, that understand that they exist, that have some sort of self-awareness, that are rational or will be rational, will be able to make decisions for themselves. So while there can be degrees of personhood, it seems that if we look at Baby Teresa, we might question whether in fact she falls under this general moral principle. So Baby Teresa will not be able to perceive the external world. She will never have self-awareness. She will not be able to perceive anything. She won't be able to see, to hear, to experience any of the things that we normally associate with persons, including things like remembering. So if that's the case, then it might be the case. It is wrong to use people as a means to other people's ends, but maybe in this case, one way of approaching the argument would be to say, but baby Treese isn't a person. Now, of course, this would require more fleshing out, more being more specific. How many things do you have to be a person? Does it biology plus understanding, perception? How many of those things do you need? But you can see that something that seems to be a fairly straightforward argument, it seems to be a valid argument, it looks like a sound argument, but even so, we can still ask some moral questions about this case. We can still look at this and say there are some ambiguities here. So what then is morality? If we don't have a sort of absolute definition, and I think it's impossible for one to be given, what would be a minimum conception of morality? What should we look for in any moral theory, regardless of which theory we end up embracing, the one that we think is the right one? What would the minimum conception of morality be? Well, first, I think it's obvious that good reasons are part of a minimum conception of morality. The morally right thing to do is determined by the best reasons for a certain course of action. So whatever else we want to say, I don't think we want to say bad reasons are things that we should take in when we're considering moral arguments. I think we want to say that there should be good reasons. Now, again, without getting into too many difficulties right off the bat here, what is a good reason versus what is a bad reason? I think some of that will come out as we read the various theorists and see what kind of justifications they give. But I think we want to say that good reasons over bad, that some reasons like, I just feel like this is the right way, or because so-and-so said so. So the logical fallacies you might have taken in a critical thinking class. The fact that someone says something doesn't make it so. The fact that someone feels something doesn't make it right. The fact that somebody believes something doesn't necessarily give me a good reason. I want something more than that. So good reasons are something we're going to look for in any moral theory that we're going to embrace. Secondly, it's impartiality. There's nothing that irritates philosophers, and in particular moral philosophers, more than a lack of impartiality. The morally right thing to do should treat each person's interests as equally important. So it shouldn't be the case that I can say something to you like this. Gee, my students online, I think that what they should do is send me $1 every time they log on to my course. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell all of you now, you ought to send me $1 every time you log on to the course. And you might say to me, well, why should I give you $1? And I say, because I have an interest in getting your dollars. I want more dollars. And you say, yeah, but I have an interest in keeping my dollar. And I might say, yeah, but I have an interest in getting your dollar. And you say, but that doesn't make any sense. That's you're acting as if your interest in my money is more important than my interest in my money. And I said, yeah, that's right. I think most of us want to reject that. They say it's sort of arbitrary, right? Well, why should I give to you? You haven't given me a good reason. And in fact, you've privileged your interest over mine with no good reason. Now, it's not to say that we're always impartial between people's interests. I might have an interest in torturing people, but we might say, well, look, your interest in torturing people is overridden by their interest in not being harmed. So, of course, we want to say that at least initially, everyone's interests are equally important. And then we have to say, yes, but can we justifiably treat one person's interests over another? And in fact, this is going to be sort of an idea that goes throughout all strains of morality. So if we're talking about utilitarianism, for example, the utilitarian might say, well, the good of the whole matters more than the good of the individual. And some might say, well, why does the good of the whole matter more? Why should my interest, my individual interest, not trump the interest of the whole? Maybe everyone's wrong, for example. And so you can see how these good reasons and impartiality are going to be part of any sort of minimum conception of morality. So as you're going through the course and as you're going through the textbook, I want you to keep these things in mind. Does the author give you good reasons for supporting their moral viewpoint? Are their reasons impartial? Do they treat some person's interests as somehow privileged when they shouldn't? So this is what we'll take as a minimum conception. And as we go along, I think you will quickly find that you'll be attracted to one sort of morality over another if you aren't already. All right, well, that's all I have about the first chapter on morality. I hope that gives you a sense of what's going on. And we'll pick it up from here. We'll be going on to some meta-ethical theories that I think will start to make some of this a little more clear to you.